Now, our founder and chairman, Bruce Langford, has guided our organisation for over 30 years. Many of you know him or heard of him. And he started our organisation with Professor Fiona Stanley after his daughter contracted pneumococcal meningitis. He is an example and a leader of how parents, patients and health professionals can all work together to make a really positive difference, be a voice and have a really significant impact on our community. Now, in this room and online, unknown to a lot of you, there will be dads. Dads like Bruce, whose children have disabilities and no voice of their own. So I am really, really excited this afternoon to introduce you to D-Dads, which is short for Disability Dads. And they were founded by our chairman, Bruce. This amazing group of dads are local dads with a son or daughter living here in Western Australia whose son or daughter has a disability. Their purpose is to raise the visibility of our community, of disability in our communities, ensure the very best opportunities and life experiences are available to all with a disability, and ensure they live safely and are included in their communities. It is so important. These dads share their stories to raise greater awareness of real lives impacted. They identify opportunities and seek great outcomes for all. So, it is with absolute delight that I welcome and thank these really special D-Dads for taking the time out of their busy days to come along and speak to us today. I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Alan Langford, former Bankwest Chief Economist, who will chair the panel today. Mr. Kane Blackman, CEO of Good Sammys. Give them a wave, Kane, so they know who you are. Yep. Mr. Cronstedt, WA Advocacy Manager of FPA Australia. Do you want to give them a wave, Mal? Yep, thumbs up. And Mike Duncan, Global Account Manager for Brunel. So please join me in making these gentlemen welcome today.
Great, thanks very much, Karen. Look, we've got a good cross-section of D-Dads here today. Mel and myself both retired and have adult disabled children, so one of the briefs that we were given by ETA was to talk about that transition from school to beyond school life, whatever that may be. And Kane and Mike both have younger children, so they've still got that part of their journey to go through. And indeed, also Kane and Mike will sort of bring the perspective of rare disorders as well, which is great. As Karen mentioned, our founder is Bruce Langford, and who, apart from his establishment of meningitis all those years ago, is well known to a lot of you as the long-time chair of Disability Services Commission, co-founder of Disability Assembly, etc., and sort of multiple world champion, all sorts of advocacy for disability. Now, while he's not with us physically today, he is watching, so no pressure, guys, but the boss is watching us on virtually, so we better do a good job here. But really, thanks to ETA for inviting us, because it's really a good opportunity for us to tell you a bit about what we are, a bit of our story. Something just fell down. That was probably my, hopefully you can still hear me. I think that was my little box on the mic. So talk about a bit about who we are. Very much it's about awareness, and I've heard that word awareness a lot of times today, and using our networks as well. Now, I did miss the first couple of sessions because I was at a Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre event today. It was about trade, but I'm also an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Business and Law at Curtin University. And sort of what's that got to do with disability? Well, you'd be surprised, because I was talking with the head of the BCEC and just what's on the agenda, and he sort of saw the DDAD's badge and was asking what that was about, and it turns out that in November they've got a report on disability employment. So that sort of rang bells, and it just so happened that half a metre from us was Chris Rodwell, who's also a DDAD, and the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, who had spoken at the event this morning. And then he was able to tell Alan that they're also doing some work, so I'll certainly be putting them in touch with Kane very shortly in terms of how we can sort of help that sort of thing. And also the Faculty of Business and Law that I'm tied with at Curtin University is where AHURI, that's the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, it's basically a body that's run by a lot of universities in Australia, and we are the faculty within Curtin that runs with that. And of course housing affordability for low-income earners, etc., is a big deal throughout the economy generally, or throughout the society generally, but particularly, obviously, it's a huge issue for disability as well. So there's a few things there. We also want to influence policy, I guess. Now there's a lot on the go. There's an NDIS review happening right now. There's a Disability Royal Commission, but as the federal minister responsible for the NDIS likes to say quite often, that the NDIS was never designed to be the only sort of lifeboat in the ocean. Indeed, it certainly is not. I think it was Sophie that talked about, who reminded us that it is, once you turn 65, of course, you're not eligible for the NDIS. So you can easily contract, obviously, MND, have a car accident, whatever, or just acquire some sort of significant disability at age 65. So it's much more than just about the NDIS. I really get annoyed, well, not annoyed, but frustrated when people talk just about the NDIS, about the escalation in the costs. It's much more than that because, for instance, rightly or wrongly, the way I read the vibes coming out of Canberra particularly is that certainly neurodiverse issues will be sort of very much at the forefront of saving or restricting the growth in the NDIS from 2027. Now that's all very well as long as there's lots of other lifeboats out there in the ocean, and I really like that term wraparound services that Janet used. It's also about more generally the health system, the mental health system, aged care, you name it, and not only about 65, but only a minority of people with disability are actually covered by the NDIS. One of the frustrating things since the commencement of the NDIS nearly 10 or pretty much 10 years ago was that it does allow sort of state governments to say, well, we don't necessarily have to spend quite as much on disability now because isn't that all handled by the NDIS? And Bill Shorten himself complains that hospitals say, they won't supply this or that because isn't that covered by the NDIS? We've really got to bring the debate, and hope DDADs will hope to sort of be some sort of modest participant in that, in looking at much beyond the NDIS, much beyond just disability, into the broader aspect. Now, as the Bankwest, I've sort of been touted in the flyer as Bankwest Chief Economist, so I guess it's down to me to talk about the economic effects of disability, which is also one of the areas that ETA had asked us to look at. So for better or for worse, it was the impetus for the NDIS did originally come from the Productivity Commission, so it certainly had an economic focus. That's been, unfortunately, Lenny used my term double-edged sword. That has been a double-edged sword over the years. So I'll perhaps call it maybe the sword of Damocles instead, because while it's great that you've got this focus, recognition that disability is an important economic aspect, it's very much much more about the social aspect as well. And there's sort of this opportunity or this expectation, I guess, and we saw what can happen with robo-debt, for instance, if you sort of allow the digital society and algorithms to determine who gets what in terms of whatever social services, including disability services, without the human intervention, then you're in. There's a big problem. So we see that we've got DDADs have got a role to play in that for sure. In fact, it was the father of the NDIS, dear old Bruce Bonahady, that used the term when there was significant inquiry into the previous government's proposal to implement individual assessments for eligibility for the NDIS. He used the term robo-planning. You know, I couldn't have put it better myself. In fact, I did think I used that in my own submission to it, because if you don't have individuals at the forefront of it, then you're in big trouble, because every single disability is individual. And there's no... Yes, look, the digital economy is great. I mean, in terms of, I've know quite a few people that self-manage, that use apps really well to sort of manage their support workers, for instance, they get, that's great. But if you don't have then, but they're still the carer, the primary carer, is the individual that's controlling that. And it's broader for society in terms of how we handle artificial intelligence, for instance, as well. But the term individuals is really important. So just to show my affiliations, I'm the Deputy Chair of WACE. Now, that's not Karen, if she's still here, WA Institute of Sport. It's Western Australia's individualised services. We use a small lowercase I in our acronym to distinguish from the WA Institute of Sport, which is unfortunate because that's the key word, individual, the individualised services. And I'm also Deputy Chair of DDWA, Developmental Disability WA, and in fact DDADS has a memorandum of understanding for administrative support with DDWA. In fact, this is how the DDADS networks, it was Mal, as a former chairman of DDWA, that tapped me on the shoulder, or grabbed me on the shoulder actually, and sort of said, what about joining the board of DDWA? And one of the big issues also generally with this whole, the bit about the state governments, federal governments through the NDIS, and incidentally, the NDIS, while it has a federal minister who runs it, and also that's the Minister for Government Services, and then the Minister for Social Services is in there as well. It is actually a joint state and federal initiative, and theoretically 50-50 funded, although somewhere along the line the federal government sort of pick up the tab for any excess costs over what it was projected to be. So it's very complicated, but you know, disabled people don't want to know about issues, demarcation issues between state and federal governments. They just want the services, and as I say, that term wraparound services is a really good one, which I'm going to use a lot more. In terms of my own story, and the other guys will briefly tell their story as well, you know, I have a 22-year-old daughter with cerebral palsy, well, we're told most likely a stroke while in utero, hemiplegia, so one side, she walks, although albeit with a significant limp, generally has to have food cut up for her because the right hand doesn't work all that much. Epilepsy as well, that sort of came a little bit later. It wasn't diagnosed for a little while, and then it gradually got worse and worse. Tried all the medications, and then at age 7 she had what they call a functional hemispherectomy, which some of you will be probably familiar with. It was spectacularly successful in that she stopped having the drop seizure, just like in the movie. She would go like that without warning, and but of course the fact that medications weren't successful and she required surgery, you know, had fairly significant implications going forward. So I have a foot in both camps with terms of physical and intellectual, and there's some challenging behaviours there as well. But to be perfectly honest, while the physical challenges are difficult, it's the intellectual ones that are more difficult to deal with, and I have a lot of empathy for cerebral palsy is very apparent, you know, to the broader public, and we're all preaching to the converted in here, but when we go outside, we've got to preach to the general public as well, including the taxpayers that are going to fund the NDIS and whatever other services are available in the future. CP is very apparent, but the intellectual stuff is not, and often very episodic, which is one of the objections I had with the proposal for independent assessments, and that it didn't necessarily take into account episodic things which would be irregular, maybe frequent, maybe not frequent, but potentially very serious when they occurred. One of the things we're asked to look at is unmet needs, and clearly it's been touched on by several people today in terms of the difficulty in getting diagnoses, and particularly with intellectual disabilities. There's a huge issue with, clearly, as we all know, with a lot can happen in those early stages of development, and if you're taking a couple of years just to get a diagnosis, so much time is lost, and that can and almost certainly will have major adverse implications throughout that person's life. In fact, there was a good, I must admit, this is something I've really learnt today. I was really hit by Antonella's story. You know, I think of that in the sort of early childhood education, but you know, her story about the 48, the lady at 48-year-old that was diagnosed, and you know, that's opened my eyes too. So by having all this dialogue, and that's why I was really pleased to get involved in this seminar today. And sorry I missed the first couple of sessions, but I've certainly seen all the rest. So what I'm going to do now is hand it over to Mal. As I say, he's the other one that's an adult, but he's also, like me, had experience with what it was like pre-NDIS, although quite a bit longer with Mal. Thank you. And he's picking up the pieces of my mic stuff. So Mal, tell a bit about your story and your experience in that transition.
Thanks, Alan. So I'll just give you a bit of a vignette of our family story, I guess. I mean, it's been great to hear some of the stuff, and I've been here since lunchtime, and it's really encouraging to be among people that furiously agree, essentially. So, you know, our challenge is, as Alan pointed out, is to, get out among the people that we influence and connect with to spread a broader message. And being part of DDWA virtually from the beginning, it's been a great pleasure to then meet with many other like-minded people with their great stories. And that really switches me to everyone's got a story. Everyone has a story, and we've heard plenty of them today. Alan's got a story, I've got a story, we've all got a story. And those stories are so incredibly powerful when they're conveyed to people who you need to connect to and you need to influence and shape. And they can really, that's the method by which I guess evolution has taught us to learn and to progress, is sharing stories. Our family, we've 3 children, 27, 26 and 19. They all have disabilities of one kind or another. Our 27-year-old is autistic, Sarah, quite clever, and socially awkward and anxiety, and had all sorts of difficulties through school. Our next one, 26-year-old Daniel, is severely autistic, and needs constant supervision and 24/7 care. Lives independently though, with 24/7 care and a whole range of challenges that you can only imagine. And many of you, you have the great depth of knowledge concerning the sorts of issues I might canvass. And our youngest, 19, Luke, Down syndrome. He's clearly the happiest of the lot and everyone's friend, which comes with its own challenges, as you can imagine, emerging in the, transitioning from high school, where you're in a very nurturing environment, where there's lots of services around you. You start very early, lots of paediatric services. It's the closest you get to wrap around. It's not, lots of fragments and lots of, bits and pieces that I'm thankful that Marcy and I, we're intelligent. We've got degrees. We've got good career. We understand how to work the system, but others may not be quite so well equipped. So they transition from high school, for Luke's case, and the sort of behaviours that might be encountered. You can't trust everyone, for example. Now, you cannot go out into the real wide world and assume that everyone deserves a hug. Well, they probably do, in one way or another, but, you've got to be a bit careful. And you can only imagine the sorts of issues that a lack of a wraparound, a lack of services, it's really apparent. I mean, with all 3 of them, you get through that high school, and then it's essentially a cliff face. And this won't be a surprise to you at all. We've already had plenty of discussions about it. And I mean, my desire, of course, my ambition, and why I'm part of it, and why I'm also part of a service delivery organisation, Disability Interchange and DDADS, and I've been part of DDWA, and, you know, after 40 years in the fire service, I thought I'd retired last year, but my wife, every time I mention it at a barbecue or a function, she just, you know, groans because I've been anything but retired.
Down the rabbit hole is what my... careful not to go down the rabbit hole.
That's right,
my wife says,
yeah. So my passion is, of course, you know, connecting with good folk like yourselves who, you know, we're really fortunate. We've got a room full of 100-odd people that largely agree, you know, we know what we're on about. We broadly agree with the sorts of sentiments that have been expressed. But, you know, advancing that cause so that individuals such as our Daniel, Sarah and Luke can live a life to the best of their ability, to the fullest possible extent, and are regarded as just people in the community, not someone with a particular label. So I even I try and avoid the word disability because I just cringe at every time I think about it, because it's simply Luke, Sarah or Daniel making their way through the world to make a difference and contribute in their way to a better world. And they can all contribute in one way or another, whether it's serving coffee at a cafe, as Luke does, with a smile and, you know, a great sense of humour, or the intellectual capacity of our daughter to solve problems and to write and so on, but not necessarily connect with people particularly well. So an idealistic world is one where disability is not mentioned and that we're simply part of a system which encourages and nurtures individuals to the best of their ability. I can see lots of nodding. It's something that we all agree to. But, you know, we've talked about, you know, that it's a chasm, a cliff face, however it is, and wrapping around and more integrating in a more holistic way of looking at what individuals might need, and providing for that. Alan, I think that's my take.
Okay, thanks, Mel. Now, over to Kane and then Mike. These guys are still in the workforce, and Kane particularly, you know, would you be the premier employer of disabled people at Good Sammys? So perhaps you can bring your perspectives in, Kane, please.
Sure, thanks. I was really oblivious to the world of disability before the diagnosis of my son Finn, who's 8. He has a rare disease and disability called Angelman syndrome, which impacts about 1 in 15,000 people in the population, and it's a genetic condition that affects the maternal chromosome 15 and the neurological pathways between a gene that expresses a protein that's absent in a lot of, in the majority of people that have the condition. So my role at Good Sammy is we employ 700 people in Western Australia, 400 of which have a disability, so over 50% of our workforce has a disability. A significant number of those people have an intellectual disability, and I'm personally very passionate about the role that employment can play to change the financial and social independence of a person with disability and their family and communities. Alan mentioned before the Productivity Commission report by the Gillard government in 2011. You know, if anyone's ever read volume 2 of that, they would have picked up that the creation of NDIS was to create significant employment outcomes for the country that was worth about $50 billion per year in increased GDP, which would pay for the system itself. We haven't actually seen the employment rate change in our country for people with disability since the introduction of the NDIS. And there are a few statistics I wanted to share, and then a few practical things to also share around disability and inclusion. We're at 3 to 3.5% unemployment rate in Western Australia and nationally at the moment. If you're a person with disability, it's 10%. If you're a person with intellectual disability, it's 20%. So in Western Australia, there's about 100,000 Western Australians with disability of working age not in employment. It's 100,000 people. If those 100,000 people aren't in employment, often the various family support units aren't participating in the economy to the same extent as well. You look across Australia, that number's 1 million Australians with disability of working age not in employment, so 1 million Australians. So we're at a great low unemployment rate for the country, yet we have 1 million people of working age not in the workplace. So there's a talent solution hiding in plain sight in this country. And if you think about the NDIS and the capability and capacity that it is to generate, only 35% of the people with disability on the NDIS of working age have an employment goal and employment funding associated with their plan, 35%. Now, the NDIA's view is that not all people are job seekers, but I'm very much keen to advocate that we start from a position of looking at what people can do and starting out with employment goals and employment funding and then working backwards from there rather than not including them. So seeing that number rise. I think there's a tremendous opportunity individually and professionally for the organisations that you work for is to look at what difference you can make, because giving someone a job gives them that sense of purpose, that sense of identity that we all have associated with our work. And you can point to government and you can point to the federal government, you can point to all these businesses and say, well, I need them to do X and Y, but you actually have the power in your own capacity as a consumer to shift the dial in that way. And I just wanted to talk about a few different things that you might be able to do to help change that. Firstly, I think the Royal Commission will come out at the end of the year with very strong recommendations about improvement for the number of people with disability on boards and senior management roles. So if any of you are working in organisations and you don't have a board member that has a disability, I think that would be a very strong recommendation you would take back to try to improve the diversity of your governance decision-making bodies. If you work for an organisation that doesn't know the number of people that have a disability, that may be a great recommendation to bring back to the people and culture teams to actually understand that proportion. We're already tracking diversity cohorts for women in leadership and Indigenous Australians, but not necessarily people with disability. So it's no surprise then we're not achieving the same employment outcomes. If you're an organisation that procures services for printing, gardening, various aspects, you can actually procure those services from organisations that will create jobs for people with disability. So you can use your power as a consumer to spend to create jobs for disability. And even if you have a gardener at home that comes, you can talk to an organisation that will provide those gardening services to create a job. And if you're at the local cafe and seeing a sign wanting a local barista, you should be talking to those shop owners and saying, well, have you thought about this talented cohort of 100,000 people in Western Australia who are looking for a job potentially and trying to attract through that? Because when I look at Good Sammy and the 400 people with disability that we provide employment to and the impact of a job, of the relationship, the social connections, the sense of purpose and identity, it very much changes an individual's pathway and identity and contributes significantly to the Australian economy as well. And so I'm very grateful for that lived experience through my son. And I also think that there's a lot of reform that we need in this state and country as well through the educational pathways as well. So I just wanted to flag that the state government has also recently announced an educational review of secondary school pathways that Minister Booty had announced, and that will provide an excellent opportunity for anyone that might be supporting people with disability with neurological conditions to identify where some of the issues are occurring in secondary schools with a lack of pathways, with a lack of focus on supports, vocational training and relationship to the NDIS. So I encourage all of you to contribute into that. And just lastly, in terms of promoting inclusion for all, I think there's a great deal of shared advocacy that everyone in the room does, and really encourage you to root that advocacy in the state disability strategy as well. There's a very clear document the state is committed to implementing, and I think if you can identify the areas of your organisation's needs and mission and vision and align it to parts of that state disability strategy, when you are talking to members of parliament, when you are talking to funders, it'll be much more powerful as well. So just encourage you to really root your advocacy and inclusion activities in the state disability strategy.
Yeah, thanks, Kane. Those pathways to education are really important because, as I say, if the NDIS, and my reading could be wrong, but to the extent that they're going to sort of suggest that the place for neurodiversity is outside the NDIS or only inside in rare instances, then yes, it's incumbent on this, where the state governments, of course, are responsible for the education system, and they really need to make sure those pathways are there. Otherwise, yeah, great example again of it's not just all about the NDIS. So, Mike, would you like to share your story, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, Alan. It's great to be here. Like Kane, my first exposure to, I suppose, disability was with my daughter. So I've got 3 daughters. Middle one, Sadie, has a rare syndrome called Rubinstein-Taybi syndrome. And essentially, I knew nothing about the sector. I knew nothing about disability. Life was trucking along quite nicely. My wife and I had moved over from New Zealand. We had our eldest, and not long after arriving, became pregnant with Sadie. And really, it was quite a journey from that point, you know. And what it was it's a genetic abnormality, but you don't get the diagnosis straight away. So it's sort of open-ended. You know that there's something wrong, but you don't quite know what's wrong. I guess if you had everything, it was black and white, you could make firm decisions, and you would sort of know the path you were going down. But we didn't know that, we didn't understand that, and you're progressing down a path, not quite knowing where you're going, not quite knowing what's happening. Obviously for ourselves, we weren't natives of Perth, so we didn't have the sort of, I suppose, the support network around us that maybe others might have done. But you shoulder on and you do the best you can. And essentially, you know, it's been a long road with Sadie. She's in a good position at the moment. She's now 13 years old. She enjoys life. But it's been difficult in terms of, I suppose, the support, accessing the support, understanding what's available, as both Alan and Mal have touched on. My wife and I, you know, reasonably educated, know how to hold a conversation, and thankfully we managed to navigate through the NDIS process. Initially, when we got our first plan, it was woefully inadequate, and ultimately we had to fight and fight and fight. And now, thankfully, through entering the complex care pathway of the NDIS, we've got sufficient funding, and we're on a route that hopefully will be sufficient for both for Sadie and for the family. But had we not fought, had we not advocated for our daughter and advocated for the rest of the family, because obviously the impact is not just on Sadie, but the impact in particular is on her sisters, then, you know, God only knows what might have happened and what the outcome would have been in terms of the plan. And I do think, and I heard it mentioned earlier, I do think about others that maybe aren't in that position to advocate and to fight and to know how to navigate that process to really get what their sons or daughters deserve. So we're now in a situation where Sadie is 13, and we're looking at sort of what the avenues are and what the pathways are for her going forward. Whether she's able to work, we're unsure. But as Kane mentioned, one of the, I suppose, the focuses of DDADS for this year is to look at employment opportunities for people with disabilities. In particular, there seems to be a bit of a range within the DDADS group that there's a majority of intellectual disabilities, so it's obviously looking at employment possibilities for those. In a professional capacity, I work for a recruitment company, so obviously we employ individuals ourselves, but we work with other organisations and help place people into these organisations. And, being in Perth, being in WA, primarily we're looking at the resources sector, and obviously the large employers within this sector have well-established diversity, inclusion, belonging groups and teams and policies in place. However, what's severely lacking is the emphasis on people that have some sort of disability, people that might be neurodiverse. There is a great emphasis on equality in the workplace, women in particular working in technical positions, Indigenous and First Nations employment possibilities, but much further down the list, even if they're actually on the list, is those that maybe do have some sort of disability, and what are the options and what are the employment possibilities for those. So that's something that, you know, I'm quite keen and passionate about, and we as a group are looking to really promote with the organisations and the people that we touch, and I'll do that both in a personal and a professional capacity. I think the next thing to add, just in terms of DDADs as a group, you know, as I mentioned earlier, my first exposure to disability was when Sadie was born. I didn't meet another dad of a disabled person until I think 2019 or 2020 when I joined DDAD. So, you know, I look around the room and predominantly, you know, a female audience, mums and professionals within the sector, and it seems that, you know, the mothers are normally the primary carers. So the dads are often the sort of, you know, the unheard sort of voice. They're there, you know, maybe providing the financial support, just because that's how things are worked out. And so for me, obviously meeting other dads, some that have been on the journey for a long time, some that are sort of more towards the start of the journey, like say Kane, it's been really fantastic. We're not there as a sort of a support group for each other, but it is I suppose, an underlying benefit that we actually meet together, and we have people that I guess understand the journey that we've all been on. Every journey is unique, though. That's the case, and that's what I've learned. But it is good to be able to share the stories together. As Mal said, it is a story, and everybody has their unique story. And we hope that as a group, we can work together and advocate for our sons and daughters, and for the sector as a whole, and hopefully bring about some change. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Look, I'm really glad you talked about saying you're still to determine whether Sophie will be able to work, because it was remiss of me. One of the reasons I cringe about having to talk about the economic aspect of disability is that not everyone can, because so much attention is on you know, improving employment outcomes and, you know, filling that void of, you know, there's unmet needs there in terms of the businesses are crying out for skilled labour, but not everyone can work. I mean, I'm not saying it's a majority, but a significant minority of people with disabilities are unable to work, or they're not able to work very much, and there's some people that will never work, and it's really, as I say, that's why I cringe a bit about that sort of stuff. So I meant to mention that, so I'm glad you gave me an opportunity, Mike, and I see my little clock says we've got 9 seconds, 8 seconds, so that's pretty good timing, Etta. I for one, am certainly going to be around for the sundowner afterwards, so happy to have chats. I don't know if any of my fellow D-dads, but be certainly happy to have a chat more informally afterwards. Thanks, Etta.